This next segment is brought to you by Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office. You know, Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, to loggers, and miners. That was back in 1965, 60 years ago. That's when the Blues developed the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Well, today, Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care, partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families, all working hard for America's working families and for the health of America. You can learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter. And remember, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. Well, let's go to line number one and welcome to the show, Eric Bernardino. And once again, this is a segment we call Labor 131, and we'll be commemorating the 131st anniversary of the creation of Labor Day, 1894, when Grover Cleveland signed into law legislation creating this holiday. Eric, welcome to America's Workforce. Thanks for joining us today. Eric is an assistant professor of history at Bates College out of Portland, Maine. And we're going to talk about something that happened back in 1938, the Pecan Sheller Strike in San Antonio, Texas. Very significant labor movement that we're going to talk to Eric about. But before we get into that, educate me a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in this line of work. I understand you're originally from Los Angeles. You went to the other side of the country. Let's talk about that. Go ahead.
Well, first, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and talk about a strike that I am really interested in. I have been for a long time. How did I end up in Maine? Well, I went to graduate school in California. I've lived in California my entire life. And I got a job in Maine, as most academic professors do. We don't really get a say in where we necessarily end up. How I got in, it ended up getting a PhD in history is I took a class on Mexican American history at UCLA, where I did my undergraduate with Juan Gomez Cuñones, who is a Chicano labor historian. And it was the first time that I had sort of heard any version of history that included Mexican Americans in the United States. And that was really sort of foundational for me. That, alongside with my grandfather, I used to sort of have conversations with him, asking him about his life and trying to understand why it was that he said certain things about the things he had experienced. And so those two things really came together. I just wanted to keep learning more, and that's how I ended up spending the next 7 years getting a PhD, and now here I am.
There you go. A thirst for education, especially a deep dive into history and how we got where we are today. Well, let's go back. Let's go back to 1938 and what happened in San Antonio, Texas, which involved predominantly Mexican-American women. And once again, low wages. We're always dealing with wages, it seems. But let's go back to that time, Eric. It's all yours.
Sure. So I thought I would start with a letter that Emma Tenayuca wrote in December of 1938. Emma Tenayuca is somebody who I'm going to talk about a little bit, hopefully. So she writes this letter to the San Antonio workers, and she says, "Greetings, comrades. I extend a very fraternal greeting to all UCAPAWA members, and I wish you a happy new year. At the same time, I congratulate you on the great victory you have just won." I'm referring to Seligman's recently signed contract with the union. Last year saw the great struggles of the Mexican masses in the states of Texas. We can say that the strike of the pecan workers of San Antonio established the militant unionism among the Mexican masses. This was the first strike that San Antonio has seen that, in spite of the obstacles that the state administration used, succeeded. Victory because of the determination of the Mexican masses. It's a really sort of interesting letter that she writes in December of 38. This is after the strike has taken place, after the contract has been signed. But she writes this letter because she's in New York City. She's not among the workers she had been organizing for in 1938 and in prior years. And so Emma Tenayuca's role in this strike is really sort of an important one, even though as it's successful because between 8,000 and 12,000 workers take part in it. She's really sort of the one who we have the most knowledge about, because she's the one who there's a lot more written on her about. And so the strike, why does the strike happen? Or why it does happen in San Antonio specifically? In order to understand that, we sort of have to understand sort of the place of San Antonio in the pecan industry. So in the 30s, about 40% of the pecan supply came from the state of Texas. The Southern Pecan Shelling Company, which is what the company who the strikers struck against, produced about 15 million pounds of pecans a year. And that's valued roughly at about $1 million at the time. And in 1926, the company decided to move away from mechanization and toward workers hand picking, hand shelling pecans. And it does this mostly because it figures out that the owner figures out that he can pay substantially lower wages to Mexican workers than he would even spend through mechanization. Um, and this is at the time, this is the 1930s where the New Deal politics our New Deal policies are starting to take place, and he's able really to sort of maneuver and use these same regulations that are meant to protect workers, really to sort of profit his company. And so he refuses to recognize the government codes that are supposed to set wages at higher levels, because he was able to successfully argue that pecan shelling work was actually agricultural work, and that was exempt from a lot of the New Deal legislation, like the Wagner Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and a lot of the New Deal policies. And so that really sort of legislatively, and he's able to sort of like manipulate the situation to his benefit. On the other side, he also is benefiting from the fact that pecan shelling work is seasonal. The season runs roughly from November to May. It's largely contract labor based. 90% of the workforce is women, and a family earned about 5 to 6 cents per pound for shell pecans. And in the average income, yearly income was about $192 before the Depression. After the Depression, wages go from about $2 a week to about 16 cents a week. And so that's sort of like what's happening at the larger level. And of course, this is taking place in the 1930s when you have the deportation of Mexican Americans throughout the United States, particularly in the Southwest, in places like Los Angeles and Texas. Upwards of 1 million Mexicans, both foreign-born and U.S. citizens, are forcibly repatriated back to Mexico because of sort of the conditions in the United States in the Depression. So that's sort of like what's happening at the larger level. And then Emma Tenayuca had been or was from San Antonio, and she had since early childhood had been really involved in sort of the Mexican American community. Um, and when she's 16, she takes part in a strike that she's arrested for. It's called the Ferenc Cigar Strike of 1933. She's a 16-year-old. She just takes part in the picket, and she's arrested along with the striking workers. She eventually joins the Communist Party, and this is really where she enters sort of the scene in San Antonio, because part of what she does in San Antonio is she becomes the secretary of the West Side Unemployment Councils. And so, because of her work with the West Side Unemployment Councils and eventually the Workers Alliance, she becomes very sort of integrated into the Mexican American community. She's often at the WPA offices, protesting or fighting for better pay for Mexicans in San Antonio, for housing improvements, for quality food was a big one. And so, because of her activism with the unemployment councils and the Workers Alliance, she's able to grow the Workers Alliance in San Antonio pretty substantially, and it reaches about 3,000 workers. And so that's how she sort of comes in, and sort of how workers get to know her. Um, and that's really sort of like why eventually they are very sort of protective of Emma Tenayuca. They call her the La Pasionera, or the passionate one, because she's a very sort of a fiery speaker and orator. So that's how sort of she becomes involved in that. So to the strike itself, and you can stop me and ask me questions if you want, or if I'm going too quickly, please. I can talk a bit about this. So we have what Seligman's desire for lower wages, the Depression, and an economic recession. What happens in 1938, or at the end of 1937, is that Seligman announces a further wage cut of about 5% wage cut. And so what you have is workers who are already being paid very, very low wages are now being told, in the midst of a depression, your wages are going to go even lower. And that seems to be alongside sort of the pressures of being removed from relief roles. That's a step too far for the workers. And in January of 1938, about 8,000 workers walk off the job, off the factory floor in the Southern Pecan Shelling strike. Initially, um, as I said 5%, it was about 15 to 20%. And really what it is the wage cut, the poor working conditions, and the necessity of doing homework. Tenayuca, who had been advocating and calling for higher wages and better working conditions, um, earlier in the 1930s, is elected as the honorary strike leader, because many of the workers themselves were part of this organization, the Workers' Alliance. Um, but because she's a registered member of the Communist Party, the local city officials, the mayor, and the chief of police sort of label her a very common thing that we see in labor strikes, an outside agitator.
Right.
She's immediately arrested and charged as an agitator. And because she's arrested, she's taken into the local jail. There's a famous picture of her standing right outside of her jail cell. The Mexican community of San Antonio goes to what's called Milan Park in San Antonio, and they basically stage a protest or demonstration in support of Tenayuca, and they chant her name. And this is really sort of iconic because it demonstrates that she was so beloved by these workers that they went to picket outside of the county jail for her. And the role of women here is really important because, as you noted earlier, the majority of these workers were women.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is that as the strike is taking place, it's actually the women that are the ones who are sort of organizing or educating their husbands and their children by bringing them to the picket lines. And this is really sort of important because what we see is that oftentimes when they're arrested, because they are arrested by the police, is that women oftentimes, as we see in sort of the iconic Salt of the Earth film, that the scene where the women are taken into the jail, they take their children with them to jail. And so that's sort of a tactic that women are able to deploy. And oftentimes when they're arrested, they actually are willingly arrested as a tactic to undermine sort of the power that the police officials then have when they threaten arrest. Because sure, take us to jail, that's fine. And that's a recurrent theme that we see throughout labor strikes in this time period. And so what happens is the strike takes place. There's picketing. There's police don't allow the workers themselves to picket outside of the company. There's a lot of rules, local regulations that they use to arrest workers. For example, they have to be careful not to spit in the direction of a police officer because that would be an arrestable offense.
Wow.
It's a violation of public health, tuberculosis and the like. And so they have to be really careful in what they do and how they sort of circumvent and go around city ordinances.
So essentially, it sounds like they were almost making up certain things that were crimes that they could charge these people for because they were so-called agitators. Is that what I'm hearing here?
Yeah, specifically with Tenayuca, but others as well. The local officials just made up charges. When the ACLU of Texas goes into court to try and sort of say the workers themselves are being arrested and beaten, court just dismisses the charges. Like, no, the police are just doing their jobs.
You know, Eric, I got to take a quick break here. Eric Bernardino is joining us on behalf of our Labor 131 segment. He's an assistant professor of history at Bates College, and we're talking about what happened back in San Antonio, Texas in 1938, the Pecan Sheller Strike. We'll continue with Eric right after this. Once again, you're listening to America's Workforce. And remember, you can check us out on at least 5 platforms. That includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, here's what you do. Just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. We always appreciate those 5-star ratings, so please keep them coming. And thank you for keeping America's Workforce the #1 union podcast in America for 2 years in a row. Marching toward 3 right now. All right, let's go back to our live line, and we're going to continue with our Labor 131 segment. 131 years ago is when Labor Day was officially proclaimed a national holiday, and our featured guest today is Eric Bernardino. comes out of Bates College in Maine, where he serves as an assistant professor of history. We're talking about what happened in San Antonio, Texas, back in 1938, Pecan Sheller Strike. And you were saying it started off with about 8,000, eventually grew to about 12,000 shellers that walked off their job, and for very good reason. They took a huge cut in pay. Now, just refresh me. They were averaging like about $2 a week, some less, some more. And they eventually, because there was a depression going on, they brought their wages down to 16 cents a week. And at the same time, I assume the company was making a good chunk of money. What kind of money were they making back then, Eric?
So the company made roughly about $1 million, or produced about $1 million worth of pecans a year.
Okay.
And so, again, Seligman, who was the owner, understood that in order to sort of create more profit, really, it was through the avenue of pay workers less.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they still do that today. Some things never change. But let's talk about what happened at that strike. You mentioned the key person, Emma Tenayuca, who she had affiliations with the Communist Party, and they used that against her, which is very, very typical. There was a lot of labor unrest going on in the country back then. I mean, talk about the Great Depression. People were hurting. I mean, unemployment in some areas was at 50%, 25 to 50%. Now, did they try to affiliate with a union at that time? Talk to me about that part.
So you're going to put me on the spot and try to remember what the acronym stands for, which is, it's a mouthful. It's called UCAPAWA, United Cannery, Agriculture, and Packing Allied Workers of America. I think that's right. It's a mouthful.
Okay, I get it.
Eventually, they changed their name to the Food and Tobacco Workers of America. But at this moment in time, UCAPAWA was the most militant union of the CIO. It was the one that was out in the streets doing these types of actions and trying really to organize the workers who were left out of more traditional labor unions. And so UCAPAWA was really the forefront of this. Dawn Henderson was the leader of it. Eventually, Luisa Moreno comes in, and she's the first woman to be hold national office for a labor union, and she participates in the strike as well. But what's interesting, you mentioned sort of solidarity. One of the most interesting things about the strike itself, and this is right, this is happening at the moment in time where the AFL and the CIO are in tension with each other, right? The AFL has a particular vision of labor unionism, and the CIO has a very different version of that, and that gets played out in this strike because the AFL brands the CIO and this local union communist agitators, and it doesn't support them. It actually works against them, and to try and sort of undermine the strike itself. And the CIO, for its part, does send union observers down to sort of try and observe and try to organize. And really, what it's trying to do is to shift the tactics of this strike away from what had been sort of a confrontational approach, right? Picketing in the streets, enticing arrest, to one sort of a more traditional collective bargaining and negotiation and agreement. But in doing that, the CIO really sort of like leans in to the communist labeling of Tenayuca specifically. One of the things that happens with Tenayuca is that because she was a member of the Communist Party, and the CIO is shifting tactics at this moment in time away from that confrontational approach, is that she's sort of left out in the cold. So in that letter that I read at the very beginning, she's not in San Antonio anymore. The strike is successful. They get a new contract. Then Ayuka is no longer there, and the reason for that is because of the actions of the CIO. So she says of this strike, she says that she's the one that organized it. She led it, and then Dawn Henderson, who's the president of the UCAPAWA, came in and sort of like pushed her out. She was given the choice of leaving, and the reason given that if she left, the strikers themselves might be more successful because the local media had very, very successfully painted her as a communist. And so the leadership says, if you leave, then we'll have more ability to negotiate. And so she's essentially pushed out. And that's when Luisa Moreno, who is a Guatemalan immigrant who had organized workers in Florida, in Texas, in California, in New York, comes in and sort of leads that, is sort of the organizing wing of the strike. And then Ayuka is essentially pushed out.
So, Eric, from what I understand, they eventually got a wage increase, but apparently some jobs were lost because I guess they kind of automated some of the process when it comes to pecan shelling. What do we know about that?
So they did eventually gain union recognition. They go to arbitration board, and the arbitration board says that that Seligman has to negotiate in good faith with the union. And what initially they do, it happens in two stages. They agree to go back to work at the set wage of 5.5 cents. It's divided by pecan cracking and pecan shelling. So 5.5 cents and 6.5 cents for each. They gained a closed shop, a checkoff system to make sure that they're actually being paid for what they're producing, a grievance system. And the promise, or the sort of the agreement, is that eventually they're going to raise wages to 7 and 8 cents per pound of shelled pecans. And that's what they're negotiated, but that is pending exemption approval to the New Deal legislation. And so they agree that there's going to be a period of time where they're going to be paid lower, but eventually they'll be paid these higher wages.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned sort of the threat of mechanization. What happens is that Seligman, because he after the union wins their higher wages, they negotiate and say that they're going to allow these higher wages pending approval, which means that he's going to try and sort of gain exemption to some of the New Deal legislations. That doesn't happen. They don't get the exemptions, and by 1942, the entire pecan shelling industry is mechanized. And so you see the loss of thousands and thousands of workers because he just shifts then, right? He went to workers themselves and avoided mechanization because he could pay them less. Once he has to pay them more, he goes right back to mechanization.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of the sort of the triumph and the tragedy of largely all of labor history, right?
Yeah. It sounds like whack-a-mole. It's a constant battle. You win one, you lose one. And that's exactly what happened back in the late 1930s in San Antonio, Texas. Well, Eric, thank you for sharing this story. Eric Bernardino, our featured guest for Labor 131 out of Bates College in Portland, Maine, assistant professor of history there, talking about the Pecan Sheller Strike in San Antonio, Texas, 1938, and the story of Emma Tenayuca, a very prominent labor activist, kind of like the Mother Jones of her time in Texas. And it's great to know, as I'm doing this series, and I have to share this with you, a lot of what happened back then was led by women. The garment workers, I mentioned Mother Jones for the coal miners, but I'll tell you, they didn't take any crap. They wanted to change things around, and they made an impact. There's no question. I'm going to leave it on that note. Thank you so much, and keep in touch with us, okay?
Thank you for having me.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be joined by members of AFSCME Council 31 out of Champaign County, Illinois, and talk about what a threat of a strike did and how the workers got a new contract. Back in a few minutes, you're listening to America's Workforce.